Extreme UK, which is a series on BBC Three, recently had an episode called MenAtWar, which was ostensibly about men's rights activism, but really wasn't. Now, I don't particularly consider myself to be a men's rights activist, though I've been called that a lot. I consider myself to be an egalitarian with a focus on men's issues. I avoid calling myself a men's rights activist per se, for many of the reasons that I would avoid calling myself a feminist, because there's baggage that goes with each one. But that said, I feel that the men's rights activists were mistreated, misrepresented, and indeed barely present in this show, and so it's worth bringing them up on that, because at least it's something I know about. So I'm going to go through it in the way it was presented and tackle some of the things that were brought up. Now, the first person they talk to is Roosh V, who, if you're not familiar with him, is a pickup artist, or former pickup artist, depending on how he's feeling on that particular day. He is not a men's rights activist. Pickup artists, it's about game, methods and so on for picking up women. It has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with men's human rights activism. Now, there was a good point that was brought up, but again, it's still really nothing particularly to do with men's rights activism, in that the way that he's been banned from speaking, the protests and so on that have gone on, the attempts to keep him out of various countries and so on, are hugely illiberal, and that they're a problem. And many of these same tactics are used in order to prevent talks on genuine men's human rights issues. So that was tangentially relevant in that it's a problem, but it's not just a problem for men's human rights activists, it's a problem for feminists as well. If you look at the way Germaine Greer and so on have been prevented from talking, you can see that there's a big issue going on here, and it's an issue that comes from this new school of feminism. The thing is, treating people like Roosh like that, and choking off discussion in the way that has been done, actually strengthens people like Roosh. It makes them look like they possibly have something interesting or useful to say. It also means that since you can't have civilized discussions about these topics, it goes underground, it becomes more extreme. The presenter also took Roosh's article about the, quote, legalization of rape on private property, end quote, seriously, when it was satire. And he also victim blamed in the sense that he was kept kind of pushing the idea that Roosh should take responsibility for the dishonest attacks on him and misunderstandings of what he said. But to reiterate, despite all that, Roosh is not a men's human rights activist. The next segment was Dapper Laughs. Now, Dapper Laughs, again, is not a men's human rights activist. He's a comedian with a character that he portrays who is a stereotypical lad. It's nothing really to do with men's issues, but again, the way in which he's been attacked and censored is definitely a problem. It's just not a problem that's limited to men. Again, there was this pushing this idea of guilt, of victim blaming. Again, why should he be repentant? Why should he be censored? Now, he made good points about these censorship issues, and that I don't like it has become this is wrong and should not exist. So if people find things offensive, so what? Don't watch, don't listen. Satire, which is what, again, Dapper Laughs is, should not be allowed to die. But again, to reiterate, Dapper Laughs is not a men's human rights activist. They went to Speaker's Corner next, and talked to a guy called Ron, very, very briefly, which is a shame because he seemed to be the first actual men's human rights activist that they'd even looked at. You could see the way he was being shut down and yelled at from the crowd, which again suggests a problem, but there was virtually no time spent on it, or on him. The next section they talked about the Manosphere, but there was a misunderstanding here again. The Manosphere is just it's like blogosphere, just with a male focus. It's anything online that could be considered a male space, and that includes a bunch of male feminist sites. But they were treated it like absolutely anything related to men, anywhere on the internet, is part of men's human rights activism, which again, simply isn't true. The presenter Reggie doesn't seem to have an up-to-date concept of what modern feminism is, and so because he's operating on, I guess, dictionary feminism, the idea that it means equality, that would be egalitarianism, he doesn't understand where these people are coming from, a lot of them, where anti-feminism is coming from, why people are concerned by the overreach of this modern Tumblrist feminism. He also doesn't seem to understand the internet at all in questioning why people might be hiding their identity or why they might be unwilling to talk to him. And yet, with this program, he's proved why people were unwilling to talk to him, why people were suspicious of the BBC. They've been burned too many times, they've been misrepresented too many times, and for all his appeals otherwise and his confused expression, what did he do in this program? He misrepresented them. They talked to Milo Yiannopoulos a little. Milo's not really a men's human rights activist either, but he, like me, is somewhat concerned with men's issues, even though we're on opposite sides of the political spectrum, and I disagree with a lot of what he says, but then a lot of what he says is basically professional trolling. But he was taken completely at face value, completely seriously. You look at the way Reggie acted again, and you see why people were so nervous to talk to him, and why they were so concerned about being stitched up. And Milo touched on this as well. He was asked why. But then you see how Reggie was a dick on Twitter about the show and everything, and he described it as a weird sense of paranoia, but it's not a weird sense of paranoia when it's shown to be true. He tried to talk to MGTOW, which, yet again, men going their own way, which is what that stands for, are not men's human rights activists. They are kind of a reflection of the lesbian separatist movement in extreme feminism, but not quite as extreme. They're just men opting out of society, of marriage, going their own way. The clue's in the name. And he's wondering why they won't talk to him. Again, they get misrepresented, or they get represented as, sad losers coming up with some excuse why they won't have anything to do with women when they couldn't get any women anyway or something. There's a lot of that kind of shaming language that goes on. But when there are people who have lost jobs for perceived sexism or criticism of feminism and so on, I think people are justifiably upset. Some of what he was reacting to in looking at comments that were left against him, about comments about how they were sure it was going to be a stitch-up, which it did turn out to be, some of that was just trolling, which he took seriously, which suggests to me that he just doesn't understand internet culture. He's also got it backwards. He sees this as an attack on particular modern wings of feminism, when really it's a reaction to the aggression of a lot of modern feminism. We got one section, really, where he talked to a genuine men's human rights activist, a guy called Josh, who has a YouTube channel. He's a pretty good kid, but a bit unsophisticated in his thinking sometimes. He was clipped and cut in such a way as to present him in the worst possible way, including a lingering shot on a roll of toilet paper that he has in his room, with the obvious implication that he's just a wanker. Or what teenage boy isn't, really. This section was a little bit reasonable, but it was just dogged in the way that Reggie, the presenter, kept going after Josh. Why are you interested in this stuff? How is it that you're campaigning and fighting and talking on this issue? He's a teenager, late teenager, I think, and we turn away from there and we look around, and what do we see? Huge amounts of problems and protests and all kinds of stuff going on in universities on kind of the flip side of this issue, the social justice warriors, the people that take it to extremes. And yet he's wondering why Josh would possibly stand up for his own rights, his own position in society, the presumptions and prejudice against men, and he just couldn't seem to understand why. Well, if you're going to be an activist on anything, your teenage years are probably going to be it, because it's when you think you know everything. And it's when you're probably at your most impassioned and you're entering the adult world and you want to feel that you can make a difference. So no wonder Josh was getting involved in things at that age. The disbelief just doesn't seem to make sense in the broader context of teenage and young adult involvement in activist politics. To get the, quote, other side, Reggie talked to Laurie Penny, who's probably the worst person to talk to. She takes trolling seriously, or pretends to take trolling seriously, takes spurious threats seriously, or at least pretends to, and assumes that the people who disagree with her and the trolls are one and the same. And this is a huge problem across all sorts of things, all over media, all over social media. People using trolls as proof that anyone who disagrees with them must necessarily be a horrible person. But all of this horrible stuff that she mentioned also happens to men, and also happens to men's issues people. And indeed, many of her articles and so on are horrendously nasty attacks on people. So it's little wonder that it provokes a response. Much of what feminists like Laurie talk about is dangerous and horrific, such as removing the right to be presumed innocent. They also have a platform in a way that men's human rights activists simply don't. You'll find plenty of feminists in mainstream media. Apart from Dobney in The Telegraph, you probably won't find anyone advocating for men's issues in newspapers, and certainly not anyone remotely as radical as someone like Laurie Penny is, who still gets, regular column inches. She mischaracterizes the concerns that men's human rights activists and so on have as feeling threatened by loss of power, which isn't it. It's a threat to freedom. We finished up, sort of, talking about the trolling and responses to Caroline Criollo Perez over the campaign to put Jane Austen on the £10 note. Again, trolls are not men's human rights activists. Nothing to do with men's rights. The troll they talked to had nothing to do with men's rights. Other than perhaps we should look at the overreaction to trolling. Though, if you remember, a woman was jailed as well for the same thing. But prison for a few spurious threats on the internet that anyone with any sense would just block and ignore, that seems excessive. And that seems to be an encroachment on people's human rights. And as the definition of troll broadens, are we going to see these kind of laws used as a way to quell dissent? There's a definite disagreement between camps in this online culture war over what actually constitutes trolling, and people who disagree with me, to paraphrase Dawkins, cannot be a useful definition of troll. And that was pretty much it. So we got one brief mention of a guy at Speaker's Corner, and we got a little bit of time with Josh that didn't really concentrate on men's human rights issues. So, what was the point of this show? Obviously, almost no research was done, or it was horribly mislabeled. And if you don't agree that there is a problem with modern feminism, and men's issues aren't being ignored, taken for granted and swept under the rug, all you have to do is go and look at the hashtags. Hashtag Extreme UK and hashtag MenAtWar. And you can see out on display just how terrible and awful many of these attitudes that men's human rights people are fighting against are. This show was a missed opportunity. There was no research, no thought. Virtually none of it was anything to do with the topic that it professed to be. And yet people wonder why the media is distrusted. It was as bad and as biased as some of their reporting on Gamergate has been. So, I don't know. If you care about men's issues, maybe you should complain to the BBC. Maybe if enough people complain to the BBC, something will get done. But I very much doubt it.